Hello friends, welcome to my new video lecture. First of all, I would thank you all from the core of my heart for the overwhelming response that you all have given me in the last month and a half of the video lectures that I have prepared and I have uploaded. I really feel humbled, and believe me, the objective of this YouTube channel which I have created is the dissemination of as well as the sharing of knowledge in English literature. And being a literature lover, I am doing it out of my hobby and my passion, and you all are supporting me in that cause, so thank you very much. And before I start my lecture, I will once again urge you all that if you all like my lecture, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please ask your friends, your colleagues, your students to subscribe my YouTube channel, so that this subscription provides me that impetus to prepare more and more lectures. So today I'll be talking about a movement which transformed the outlook of humanity as a whole, and it affected basically it's a Eurocentric movement, but this movement later encouraged many other movements, and is the source of we can say the human progression, the identity of an individual, the value of an individual, the say of an individual. All these realizations, the root cause was this movement which started around 14th century in Italy, and it spread all around Europe till 16th century. I hope you all have guessed. Yes, my dear friends, today I will talk about Renaissance. So Renaissance, the etymological meaning basically means rebirth or revival, and in the historical period, if you take the historical cover of this Renaissance, the timeline, it covers around 300 years, marked by a revival in the field of art, literature and learning. And the main purpose, this Renaissance, it served as a bridge of transition between the medieval and the modern Western Europe. Now, if you talk about the features of Renaissance, with Renaissance began the rediscovery of the Greco-Roman civilization, which had been neglected during the Dark Middle Ages. Renaissance emphasized reason, and of course, with reason came the questioning attitude, the experimentation, and of course the free inquiry. And this is in vast contrast with the medieval concern with faith, authority and tradition. As I said, Renaissance always glorified the individual and approved the worldly pleasure, viewing life as a worthwhile for its own sake, not chiefly as a preparation for the life to come, that is salvation, which was the belief pre-Renaissance period. That man is a part of a system, man is a part of a group, and the ultimate aim of man is salvation, which somehow overlooked the identity of an individual, the value of an individual, the freedom of an individual, the wishes, the aspirations of an individual. So Renaissance this glorified this individuality. It also focused upon the secular society, and it paid attention to a secular society rather than the medieval preoccupation, which was basically with the church and the religious religious affairs. And Renaissance featured greatly, the achievements of Renaissance greatly featured can be seen in art, literature and of course in science. It was a holistic kind of a movement, the remnants of which, the influence of which, not the remnants, the influence of which could be seen in almost all the movements. Renaissance basically originated in Italy, and this benefiting the revival of trade, which was resulted from the Crusades. Italy had a very wealthy and influential people who became supporters of literature, art and science. The leading figures of this period of Renaissance were certain amount of popes in Rome, the Forza family in Milan, and the Medici family in Florence. Now, when you talk of England, the Renaissance in England, basically, from before talking about England, from about 15th to 16th, like 100 years, 1500 to 1600, that timeline, the world was reborn in many ways. There was rebirth of the world, and it started with the Renaissance in Italy, with art and architecture in the 15th century. It reached England in the 16th century, and England became one of the most powerful countries in the late 16th century. So new worlds were discovered, new ways of seeing and thinking discovered. Now we have to recall that with Renaissance came the inquisitiveness, because individuality of human being was stressed. So this inquisitiveness, this adventure of individuals led to the exploration. A lot of exploration expeditions. One of them was Columbus's discovery of America in 1492. You can take Vasco da Gama's sea route to India in 1498. There, Copernicus and Galileo made very important contributions in the field of astronomy, planets and stars. Then you had Magellan, who sailed around the world. So all, everything on every front, there was this this new energy which could be felt. The celebration of individuality, the celebration of human being as an individual, inquisitiveness, the energy could be felt, and as a result of which Renaissance could be felt worldwide. Yet, if you consider Renaissance was not only revival or rebirth, it was also an age of, I said, as it was an age of new discoveries, and that discoveries meant not only geographical, but discoveries also in the field of intellectuality, in the field of academics, and both these discoveries resulted in the changes of tremendous import for Western civilization. Now, when you talk of discovery in both the aspects, suppose for example in science, what happened? Copernicus, he attempted to prove that it is rather the sun which is at the center, and the earth moves around the sun, and rather it's not the earth which was at the center system. Thus, he tried to radically alter the cosmic worldview that was prevalent and had dominated the antiquity for a long time, especially in the Middle Ages. Now, in religion, Martin Luther played a very, very significant role. We all know that Martin Luther was the pioneer of Protestantism. And what did he do? He basically challenged and ultimately caused the division of one of the major institutions that had united Europe throughout the Middle Ages, that is the church. One more interesting feature was that the Renaissance thinkers often thought themselves as ushering something new in the modern age, as distinct from the ancient and the medieval. But if you read the history, you will find that they were somehow influenced by the classical. They were influenced from the classical, because there was always, when you talk of revival, when you talk of rebirth, what exactly are you talking of revival? We are talking here the revival of the classical. So there will always be, although these writers, they thought that they were doing something new and unique. Of course they did it, but of course there was this kind of influence, as I said, that there was this revival. So if we want to study Renaissance basically can be studied on 5 basic points. 5 basic important points that Renaissance can be looked into. The first point is, although Renaissance thinkers often tried to associate themselves with classical antiquity, and they always tried to dissociate themselves from the medieval ages. Now, important continuities with their recent past, such as the belief in the great chain of being, was very much evident in Renaissance. That is what I was saying, that there was this influence. The second point, which is very, very important, is there were certain political changes that were taking place. So, and these certain political changes were very, very significant. The third, one of the most important movements about humanity, that is humanism. So the third point is humanism. Fourth point is imitation, and connected to this fourth point is connected to the third point, that is humanistic ideals, literary doctrine of imitation, which was important for its ideas about how literary works should be created. And finally, last but not the least and the most important point is, probably became an even more far-reaching influence was the fifth point, and that was both on the literary and if you take on the modern life in general, was the famous religious movement known as the Reformation. So basically these are the 5 points which Renaissance can be looked into. Let us now talk about in details about these 5 points. So before that, let us look into some other things, such as Renaissance thinkers, they strongly witness themselves with the values of classical antiquity, particularly as expressed in the newly discovered classics of literature, history and moral philosophy. They also tended to dissociate themselves from works written in the Middle Ages, a historical period which these Renaissance precursors, they rather looked at very negatively. Now, according to them, why did they look the Middle Ages negatively? Because according to them, the Middle Ages were set in the middle of two much more valuable historical periods, that is Antiquity period and their own period. Nevertheless, as modern scholars have noted, extremely important continuities with the previous age still existed. Now let us talk about the 5 important points. The first point is the great chain of being. There was this influence. Now what exactly is the great chain of being? Let us recall the classical period. One of the most important continuities with the classical periods which was seen during this Renaissance period was the concept of the great chain of being. What was it? Its major premise on which it was based was that everything existing in the universe had its place. There was a place for everything that is existing, existing in the universe in a divinely planned hierarchical. There is always a hierarchical order which was pictured as a chain vertically extended. Hierarchy here refers to the order based on the series of higher and the lower strictly ranked gradations. I will clear this with an example. For example, a particular thing's place or object's place, it depended on the relative proportion of spirit and matter. How much does it contain spirit, the aestheticism, and matter, the physicality? It contained the less spirit and the more matter, the lower down is to. So the more you are less spiritual, your value degrades, and the more you are more spiritual with less physicality, your value upgrades. So I'll give you some examples. So at the bottom, for example, stood various types of inanimate objects such as metals, stones. They were at the bottom. And obviously the 4 important elements, that is water, air, earth and fire, they all stood at the bottom. And higher up were the members like the vegetative class, the trees and the floras and the faunas. Then came the animals, then humans, and then angels. And at the top, now if you go from the lower to the higher, at the top was the God. So you have God, angels, human beings, vegetations, animals, and then you have earth and stone. And among these also there were hierarchies. Then within these larger groups there were hierarchies. For example, among the metals, gold was considered to be the most noblest metal, and that's why, because it was considered to be the most noblest metal, that's why its rank was the highest. And lead, which was considered to be less spirit, that's why it was considered, and less spirit and more matter, because if you have less spirit and more matter, obviously your value goes down in the hierarchy of things. So in that case, lead can be seen at the bottom from the concept of the great chain of being. Though the Renaissance writers seem to be very, very quiet on the order of the theme of order or disorder is much in evidence, suggesting that the Renaissance writers seem to be quiet on the side of order, and the theme of disorder is much in evidence, suggesting that the age may have been experiencing some growing discomfort with the traditional hierarchies. That was one of the reasons, you can say. Now, the second concept that we are talking about now is, first was the great chain of being. I would like to recall that we are talking about the 5 important points from which angle we can look into Renaissance. The first is the great chain of being. Second is the most important, one of the most important is humanism. Now, humanism is a concept which developed. What exactly is it? Let us discuss. It's in a very simplified and layman's language. Humanism suggests that it gave renewed emphasis to life in this world instead of other worldly or spiritual life associated with the Middle Ages. So, humanism basically talked about individuality, expression, freedom. It oversimplified. There is nevertheless the truth, the idea that in oversimplification it can be said that the Renaissance humanists, they placed great emphasis on the dignity of man. This was something which was very, very important event happening, which did not happen in the Middle Ages. So there was a very high intensity, a very high importance given to the dignity of man upon the expanded possibilities of human life in this world. And for the most part, humanism regarded human beings as social creatures who would create meaningful lives only in association with other human beings. But in Renaissance itself, from the Renaissance perspective itself, humanism, they represented a shift. So there was a shift in humanism itself, and the shift was from the contemplative life to the active life. So the shift was from the sociality of human in a group to the individuality of human beings. The importance of human being from a group to the importance of human being as an individual, as a unique identity. Now in the Middle Ages, there was great value which had often been attached to the life of contemplation, and of course religious devotion and salvation away from this world. In the Renaissance, the highest cultural values were usually associated with active involvement in public life, in moral life, in political life, in military action, and to the service of the state. That was the difference. Of course, the traditional values, the traditional religious values coexisted. There was nothing, tampering with that. But there was this new secular values, and in fact some of the most important humanists, for example Erasmus, were a churchman. And also individual achievement, breadth of knowledge and personal aspiration, as can be seen from one of the most successful magnum opus written by Marlowe, the Dr. Faustus, they were valued. And the concept of Renaissance man refers, if you talk of Renaissance man under humanism during this period, this basically refers to an individual who, in addition to actively participating in the affairs of public life, possesses knowledge of and skill in many other subjects areas. Not only in one thing, but in many other subject areas, which included figures such as Leonardo da Vinci, John Milton, as well as Francis Bacon. However, individual aspiration was not only the major concern of Renaissance humanism. So what was major concern apart from individual aspiration? This was not the major concern of Renaissance humanists. Renaissance humanists focused on teaching how to participate and rule a society, though only the nobility and some members of the middle class were included in this ideal. How to govern, how to create an ideal society and govern it. Overall, in consciously attempting to revive the thought and culture of classical antiquity, perhaps the most important value the humanist extracted from their studies of classical literature, history and moral philosophy was the social nature of humanity. And there was this, so this was all humanism all about. Now let us move to the third concept. The third important point from which Renaissance can be understood is, one of the important characteristic points is imitation. Now this imitation concept was derived from the classical past, though it was present in the Middle Ages, but was the literary doctrine of imitation. It was present, but basically it was influenced from the classical past. Now, of the two senses that we have, we try to find we have the meaning when the word imitation comes is in which the term this term imitation theoretically has been used. The theoretical emphasis of Renaissance literary critics was less on imitation, that meant mirroring life. So the two meanings that we get, first is mirroring life. The Renaissance imitation was not concerned on this mirroring of life. Rather, it was more on the imitation that meant following the predecessors. So, following the classicals, classicists. That was from that perspective of imitation, these Renaissance writers focused on. In contrast to our own emphasis on originality, the goal was not to create something entirely new. That was not the goal. To a great extent, the contemporary critics believed that the great literary works expressing definitive moral values had already been written in classical unity. That was their belief. So, what did they do? It was the task of the writer to translate for the present readers the moral vision of the past. They were do by imitating great works, adopting them from a Christian perspective, and presenting it before the milieu. So, writing of the middle, if you say, the writers of the Middle Ages also practiced imitation in this sense, but they did not have as many classical models to work from as these Renaissance writers had. Of course, Renaissance literary critics made it very, very clear that such imitation was to be neither mechanical nor complete. What was their objective? Writers were made to capture the spirit of the originals, mastering the best models, learning from them, and then using it for their own purposes. So, you take a model, classical model, you take something from it, and then you use it for your own purpose. That was the concept of imitation according to the Renaissance writers. And despite the fact that there was many comments by critics about imitation, in this sense, it was not the predominant practice of many of the greatest Renaissance writers. For them, the faithful depiction of human behavior, what Shakespeare called the mirroring up to nature, was paramount for the Renaissance writers, and therefore imitation in the mimetic sense was more often the common practice. And among the most popular that were derived from antiquity were imitation. The popular forms that were derived in the Renaissance period was epic and satire, and even more important were the dramatic genres that was that was practiced during the Renaissance. And those basically two dramatic genres that was practiced, one was comedy and the other was tragedy. And during this time, we also have to keep in mind that Europe experienced a golden time of theatre, and this was led by great dramatist, none other than Shakespeare. Then we come to the most important part, that is the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, if you talk about, then the name that comes to our mind is Martin Luther. But let us see what exactly it is. The Protestant Reformation that developed during the time of Renaissance, and it was a movement which had very, very profound implications, not only for the modern in general, but specifically for the literary history. Just as the Renaissance humanists rejected the medieval learning, the Reformation seemed to reject the medieval form of Christianity. There was a problem, because what they mainly rejected was, I will tell you in this point, both Catholics and Protestants were humanists. Let us not argue on that. They both were humanists, but their emphasis was different. Both their object was worship and of course practice of humanism, but there were some differences. I will tell you what are the differences. In the 16th century, let us look into the historical background of this Protestantism. In the 16th century, this person called Martin Luther, he reacted against the church's corruption and he depicted it. For example, Chaucer depicted the corruption of the church through various characters in his Canterbury Tales. Now, many people associated with the church, Catholics such as Erasmus, they wanted reform in the church from within. But however, Luther had higher disagreements with the church policy, which ultimately led him to challenge some of the most fundamental doctrines of the church, which in turn led him and his followers to break away from the Catholic Church in protest. Hence, they are known as Protestants. one of the main features that this Reformation, this had very significant political ramifications also, for it split Europe into Protestantism and Catholicism, and there was a lot of war between this period. Protestantism broke up that institution, of course, which was very strong, and for a very long period of time, and this strength of Catholicism also came under the Pope, who was the boss, and Pope also played a significant role in the unification of Europe, though there were some national struggles, but Pope unified Europe. And here comes Protestantism, which totally broke away from this. So some Protestants, basically, if you say about the differences, Martin Luther believed in the Bible. What Martin Luther rejected was the Pope and the Church. And that was the fight, that was the ideological difference that these people had, the Catholics and the Protestants. This inquisitiveness of questioning, which was one of the remnants of, which was one of the main things of Renaissance, humanism, this questioning thing inspired characters like Martin Luther. And Martin Luther, basically, both were humanist, as I said, Catholics and the Protestant. But Martin Luther rejected the Pope and Martin Luther rejected the Church. What Martin Luther accepted was the Bible. Okay, so there was these followers of Martin Luther who later came to be known as the Protestants. Some Protestants also believed, this was one of the main reasons of breaking away from Catholicism, that Protestantism believed in the Bible, not in the Church, not in the Pope. The Pope's authority they rejected. There was also another group of Protestant people. I'm talking about what led to the formation of Protestantism, Protestant Reformation. They believed that after the fall of Adam in Eden, Garden of Eden, human nature was totally corrupted as far as human spiritual capabilities were concerned. So early Protestantism emphasizes on human depravity, distinguishes it simply and sharply from Renaissance humanism. So human beings, according to this group, therefore, are incapable of contributing to their salvation. For instance, through their good deeds, it could only be achieved only through the grace of God. So this concept of salvation, which was emphasized, they rejected it. Okay, so these were some of the factors from which Renaissance can be looked into and can be studied. This was a lecture in which I tried to somehow throw some light on the development of Renaissance throughout Europe from 14th to early 17th century, basically from 14th to 16th century, and how Renaissance played a significant role in the development of human society, in the development of human being, how Renaissance empowered humanity as a whole, and how Renaissance started this quest of explorations and discoveries and challenging the norms which was set for a very, very long period of time. So Renaissance played a very, very significant role overall for mankind in the reformation of mankind, and I hope the angles through which I tried to look into Renaissance will help you somehow to focus more, will help you to give you a direction through which you can explore more, research more on this topic, and enhance your understanding. I hope my video was some of a help to you, and definitely I will try to post more videos on Renaissance and Reformation. So please keep watching my videos, and if you like my videos, I would again request you all, please subscribe my YouTube channel. Thank you very much for sparing time and watching my video. Thank you very much.